The sun has been up for 3 hours, and already the sand burns hot enough to blister skin. A merchant named Khalid ibn Rashid kneels beside his dying camel somewhere in the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter of Arabia. The year is 847 CE. His water skin split 2 days ago, spilling its precious contents into sand that swallowed every drop without a trace. His lips have cracked and bled. His tongue feels like leather in his mouth. His vision has begun to blur at the edges, and he knows with absolute certainty that if he does nothing, he will be dead before nightfall. But Khalid does not panic. Instead, he does something that seems almost absurd given his circumstances. He reaches into his pack and pulls out a small leather pouch filled with smooth, polished stones. He selects one carefully, places it in his mouth, and begins to walk. This simple act, practiced by desert travelers for over 4,000 years, would keep him alive long enough to reach the next oasis. It is a technique so effective that it was shared across cultures spanning from the Sahara to the Gobi, from ancient Persia to the American Southwest. And yet somehow, in our age of portable water bottles and climate-controlled vehicles, we have almost entirely forgotten it existed. This is the story of the pebble trick, the forgotten survival technique that kept ancient travelers from dying of thirst, and the remarkable science that explains why something so simple worked so well. To understand why this technique mattered, you first have to understand what thirst actually does to the human body. We often think of thirst as simply a signal, a gentle reminder that we should drink something soon. But thirst is far more than that. It is one of the most powerful drives the human brain can produce, capable of overriding almost every other impulse when it becomes severe enough. When your body loses water, your blood literally thickens. Your heart has to work harder to pump it through your veins. Your kidneys begin to struggle, unable to filter toxins efficiently. Your brain, which is roughly 75% water, starts to malfunction in subtle ways at first, then dramatically. Confusion sets in. Decision-making deteriorates. Eventually, you lose the ability to think clearly at all, which is particularly cruel because that is precisely when you need to think clearly the most. But here is what ancient travelers understood that we have largely forgotten. The psychological experience of thirst often becomes unbearable long before the physical danger becomes critical. The sensation of a dry mouth, the constant awareness of your tongue sticking to your teeth, the obsessive thoughts about water that consume your mind and make it impossible to focus on anything else. These symptoms can break a person's will to survive even when their body still has hours of fight left in it. The ancients discovered that if you could manage the sensation of thirst, you could endure far longer than if you simply suffered through it. And the most effective tool they found for managing that sensation was placing a small, smooth stone in the mouth. The technique appears in texts from civilizations that had no contact with one another, suggesting it was either independently discovered multiple times or was so valuable that it spread along trade routes faster than almost any other piece of knowledge. We find references to it in ancient Persian manuscripts, in the oral traditions of Bedouin tribes, in the survival practices of Aboriginal Australians, and in accounts from Chinese merchants traveling the Silk Road. The instructions were remarkably consistent across these different sources. The stone had to be smooth, typically river-worn or carefully polished, to avoid irritating the delicate tissues of the mouth. It had to be the right size, large enough not to be accidentally swallowed but small enough to be comfortable. And it had to be clean, often boiled in water before the journey began, to prevent introducing illness into an already stressed body. Travelers would often carry several stones, each slightly different in size and shape, allowing them to rotate between them as the journey progressed. Some traditions specified particular materials, with certain cultures favoring quartz for its coolness, others preferring dark stones that they believed held moisture better, though this latter belief appears to have been more superstition than science. The science of why this works begins with the salivary glands. Humans have 3 major pairs of these glands, plus hundreds of minor ones scattered throughout the mouth. Under normal circumstances, they produce somewhere between half a liter and a full liter of saliva every day, keeping the mouth moist and beginning the digestive process. When the body becomes dehydrated, it reduces saliva production to conserve water. This makes perfect biological sense. but it creates a devastating feedback loop. The dry mouth signals to the brain that water is urgently needed, triggering intense thirst. The psychological distress of that thirst increases cortisol levels. The elevated cortisol further reduces saliva production. The mouth gets drier. The thirst intensifies. And so the cycle continues, each revolution making the suffering worse. What the pebble does is interrupt this cycle at its source. When you place a smooth object in your mouth, your salivary glands respond automatically. They detect the presence of something that might be food, something that will need to be processed and swallowed, and they begin producing saliva even if the body is trying to conserve water. This saliva production is small, perhaps only a few milliliters, but its effect on the subjective experience of thirst is enormous. Suddenly, the mouth feels less dry. The tongue no longer sticks to the teeth. The brain receives signals that perhaps the situation is not quite as desperate as it seemed a moment ago. The panic recedes just enough to allow for clearer thinking. There is also a secondary mechanism at work, one that speaks to the remarkable complexity of human neurology. The act of having something in the mouth to focus on, to roll against the tongue, to press against the cheek, gives the mind something to do besides obsess over water. This might seem trivial, but in a survival situation, the ability to redirect attention away from suffering can make the difference between maintaining composure and making fatal errors in judgment. The historical record is filled with examples of this technique saving lives. The Tuareg people of the Sahara, legendary for their ability to traverse seemingly impossible distances across the world's largest hot desert, considered the mouth stone as essential as water itself. A young Tuareg man learning to guide caravans would be taught the technique alongside navigation and camel handling, and he would often receive his first set of traveling stones in a ceremony marking his passage into adulthood. The Persian Empire employed specialized scouts called water finders, who would range ahead of armies and caravans searching for the next source of water. These men carried distinctive pouches containing polished stones of different colors, and it was said that a skilled water finder could survive for 3 days in conditions that would kill an untrained man in one. When Cyrus the Great led his armies across the deserts of Mesopotamia in the 6th century BCE, his soldiers were instructed in this technique as part of their basic training. The same was true of Alexander's forces centuries later, and of the Arab armies that swept across North Africa in the 7th and 8th centuries CE. Generals understood that an army which could march an extra day without water was an army that could appear where no enemy expected, strike at targets that seemed safely out of reach. The Silk Road merchants who connected China to the Mediterranean carried two kinds of currency: the goods they traded and the survival knowledge that allowed them to complete journeys spanning thousands of miles. A merchant who knew how to manage thirst, how to read the stars for navigation, how to find water in seemingly waterless places. This was a merchant who came home alive, who built wealth over decades of successful journeys, while others perished on their first attempt. Not all who used this technique were traders or soldiers. We have records of pilgrims walking from Morocco to Mecca, a journey of over 3,000 miles, much of it through brutal desert. They traveled with almost nothing, trusting in God and in the accumulated wisdom of those who had walked the path before. Among that wisdom, mentioned again and again in their accounts, was the pebble that kept the mouth wet. Perhaps most striking are the accounts from societies that developed this technique in complete isolation. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia's interior deserts, separated from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years, independently discovered the same trick. Their version used stones from sacred sites when possible, imbuing the survival technique with spiritual significance. A person walking with such a stone was not just managing their thirst, they were carrying a piece of their country with them, drawing strength from their connection to the land. Similarly, certain Native American tribes of the Sonoran Desert employed smooth stones during long desert crossings. Spanish explorers in the 16th century noted the practice with surprise, having seen it themselves among Moorish peoples in Iberia, but never expecting to encounter it in the New World. The fact that such distant cultures arrived at identical solutions speaks to both the universality of the problem and the effectiveness of the response. Thirst is thirst, whether you experience it in Arabia or Arizona. And the human salivary system works the same way whether your ancestors came from Africa 50,000 years ago or from Asia 20,000 years ago. Some solutions are simply so good that any culture facing the relevant problem will eventually discover them. But the pebble trick was never magic. It could not create water from nothing. It could not save someone who was already too far gone. What it could do was extend the window of survival, buying precious hours that might mean the difference between reaching safety and collapsing within sight of it. The accounts of those who pushed the technique to its limits are harrowing. A caravan master named Ibn Battuta, not the famous explorer, but an earlier man who shared his name, left a record of a crossing gone wrong in the 13th century. His group's water supplies were contaminated by a cracked vessel, and they found themselves with a 3-day journey ahead and only 1 day's worth of drinkable water. They rationed what they had, and every person in the caravan used the stone technique throughout the daylight hours. Ibn Battuta describes the experience in clinical detail. The way the stones helped for the first day and a half, the way they gradually became less effective as true dehydration set in, the way one man threw his stone away in frustration and was dead by the next morning, despite not being notably worse off than the others just hours before. That last detail is telling. The man who abandoned the technique did not die faster because the stone was keeping him physically alive. He died faster because without the stone, his psychological deterioration accelerated. He made poor decisions. He expended energy in anger. He lost hope. And once hope is lost in a survival situation, the body often follows where the mind leads. Ibn Battuta's caravan reached water with 4 of their original 12 members still alive. Every survivor had kept their stone in their mouth until the moment they reached the oasis. This was not coincidence. The technique persisted into the age of exploration, though it was often rediscovered rather than transmitted. European explorers of the 19th century, venturing into deserts their cultures had no experience with, sometimes learned it from local guides. Other times they stumbled upon it independently, noting in their journals that keeping a button or a coin in the mouth seemed to help with the worst of the thirst. The British explorer William Gifford Palgrave, crossing the Arabian Peninsula in 1862, described being taught the technique by a Bedouin guide. He was initially skeptical, but desperation made him willing to try anything. He reported that the effect was immediately noticeable and that he continued to use the practice throughout his travels. Similar accounts appear in the records of the French Foreign Legion, whose soldiers fought and marched across the Sahara for decades. Grizzled sergeants passed the trick down to new recruits, part of an unofficial curriculum of survival knowledge that existed alongside the official training. To know it was to announce yourself as someone who had actually served in the desert, not merely read about it. The American West had its own version of the tradition. Prospectors and pioneers crossing the Mojave and the Sonoran deserts often carried what they called lucky stones in their pockets. The name concealed the true purpose from those not in the know, but experienced desert hands understood that luck had nothing to do with it. The stones were for surviving when water ran short, and they worked as well in California as they had in Persia. With the 20th century came motorized transport, reliable maps, and eventually satellite phones and GPS. The need for extreme desert survival techniques diminished rapidly in most of the world. Travelers could carry more water, travel faster, and summon help if something went wrong. The pebble trick receded into obscurity, remembered only by a few specialized survival instructors and historians. And yet, its lesson remains relevant in ways that go beyond literal thirst. Consider what the technique actually represented. It was not a solution to the fundamental problem. It could not provide water. What it provided instead was management of suffering, preservation of psychological integrity, and an extension of the window during which a true solution might be found. The travelers who used it were not pretending they were not thirsty. They were acknowledging their thirst while refusing to let it destroy them. There is a philosophy embedded in that small stone, a philosophy of endurance that has applications far beyond the desert. In any difficult circumstance, there are the physical realities of the situation, and there are the psychological experiences those realities produce. The physical realities must be addressed when possible, but sometimes they cannot be addressed immediately. Sometimes you must endure. In those moments of necessary endurance, the The question becomes whether your psychological experience will accelerate your decline or slow it. Whether the feedback loop between suffering and desperation will spin faster and faster until it destroys you, or whether you will find some way to interrupt it, to give yourself just enough relief to maintain your capacity for clear thought and purposeful action. The ancient travelers understood that survival is not purely physical. It is also, perhaps even primarily, mental. The body can endure remarkable hardship if the mind remains intact. But a broken mind will find ways to destroy even a body that still has reserves of strength. Modern research in psychology has confirmed what desert wisdom knew for millennia. The perception of a problem often matters as much as the problem itself. People who believe their situation is hopeless give up and fail even when their situation is actually survivable. People who believe they still have a chance keep fighting and sometimes succeed against odds that should have been impossible. The pebble in the mouth was many things. It was a practical technique for stimulating saliva production. It was a focus for attention that might otherwise spiral into despair. It was a physical ritual that reinforced the psychological commitment to survival. And perhaps most importantly, it was an answer to the question that every suffering person asks: what can I do? Having something to do, some action to take, some technique to employ, this is itself a powerful antidote to despair. The opposite of hope is not sadness but helplessness, the belief that nothing you do matters. The pebble was a way of rejecting helplessness, of taking action in the face of terrible circumstances, even when that action could not solve the fundamental problem. We have largely forgotten the pebble trick because we have largely eliminated the circumstances that made it necessary. But we have not eliminated suffering. We have not eliminated situations where we must endure, where the solution is not immediately available, where the only choice is between enduring well or enduring poorly. In those moments, whether they involve physical hardship, emotional pain, or the grinding difficulty of long projects that test our patience and resolve, the lesson of the ancient travelers still applies. Find your pebble. Find the small technique, the manageable action, the ritual of endurance that will keep you functional while you wait for the oasis to appear on the horizon. Somewhere in a museum in Cairo, there is a small leather pouch containing 5 smooth stones. They were recovered from a tomb dating to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, roughly 4,000 years ago. The archaeologist who found them initially cataloged them as children's toys or perhaps gaming pieces. Years later, a desert survival expert visited the museum and recognized them immediately for what they were. Their size was right. Their smoothness was too consistent to be natural, too carefully polished for toys. They were traveling stones, the same kind that Bedouins still use today, the same kind that kept countless thousands of travelers alive across the millennia. The person who carried those stones has been dead for 4,000 years. We do not know their name or their story, but we know they understood something about survival that has been true for all of human existence and will remain true for all of its future. When the water runs out, and sometimes it does, your mind is your greatest resource. And sometimes, managing your mind is as simple as placing a stone in your mouth and taking the next step forward. The forgotten trick of the ancient travelers was never really about stones at all. It was about the human capacity to endure, to adapt, to find small solutions that make large problems survivable. That capacity lives in all of us still, waiting to be remembered when we need it most.